The autumn sunlight poured through the tall Georgian windows of Fulton County Superior Court like liquid gold, casting rectangular pools across the polished marble floor, where Marcus Thompson sat alone on a wooden bench that still smelled faintly of lemon polish. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlaced, the wedding band on his left hand catching the light in small bursts that felt like mockery. Across the aisle, separated by a distance that might as well have been an ocean, sat his wife Amelia, her silk blouse the color of champagne, her shoulders squared with a confidence that made his chest tighten. But it was the woman beside her that turned the moment from painful to surreal. Vanessa Klein leaned close to Amelia, whispering something that made them both smile, her hand resting on the table between them like a claim staked in enemy territory. When the bailiff called the court to order and Amelia reached for the pen to sign the divorce papers, Vanessa's fingers brushed hers in what could only be called encouragement. The audacity of it hung in the air, like the dust motes swirling in the sunbeams. Marcus watched the two women exchange a look of shared triumph, a silent language built on his ruin, and something in him went very still. Judge Harlan entered then, his black robe sweeping behind him, his face carved from 60 years of witnessing human nature at its worst and occasionally its best. The judge settled into his seat, adjusted the reading glasses perched on his nose, and scanned the paperwork before him with an expression that gave nothing away. But as his eyes moved from the documents to the unusual tableau of wife and mistress sitting side by side, one thick gray eyebrow lifted just slightly. In that small gesture, Marcus felt the first flicker of something that might have been hope. If you've ever watched betrayal unfold in broad daylight and wondered whether justice still exists in this world, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to remember that truth has a way of emerging even when lies seem to win, and subscribe to Acts of Depth, because what happens next in this courtroom will restore your faith in the power of integrity. This is a story about a man who built everything with his own hands, only to watch the people he loved most try to tear it down. But sometimes the very light that exposes our deepest wounds also illuminates the path to redemption. Marcus Thompson was 42 years old and carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that came from having climbed every rung of the ladder without a safety net. He had grown up in the old Fourth Ward of Atlanta, in a neighborhood where the houses leaned into each other like tired friends, and the smell of collard greens and cornbread drifted through screen doors on Sunday afternoons. His father had died when Marcus was 7, leaving his mother to raise 3 boys on a housekeeper's salary that barely covered rent. She used to say that sunlight was free, so she kept every window in their small house uncovered, letting the Georgia sun pour in until even the worn furniture seemed to glow. She taught Marcus that you could be poor in your pockets, but rich in your principles, and that lesson became the bedrock of everything he built. By the time he was 17, Marcus was working construction during the day and attending community college classes at night, his hands calloused from framing houses, his notebooks filled with sketches of buildings that existed only in his imagination. Architecture became his obsession and his escape, the way that lines and angles and light could transform space into something that made people feel safe or inspired or at home. He put himself through Georgia Tech on a combination of scholarships and sheer stubbornness, graduating at the top of his class despite professors who seemed surprised every time he answered a question correctly. His first job at Brennan and Associates was the kind where they put you in the basement office with the flickering fluorescent lights and gave you the projects nobody else wanted. But Marcus treated every strip mall and parking garage like it was the Sistine Chapel, pouring himself into the details until even the senior partners had to admit the kid had something. Within 5 years, he was leading teams. Within 10, he was being courted by competitors. By the time he turned 40, Marcus had launched his own firm, Thompson Design Group, with offices in a renovated warehouse in the Sweet Auburn district where light flooded through industrial windows, and his team of 12 worked on projects that were reshaping Atlanta's skyline. The girl from the neighborhood who used to braid hair on her front porch would stop him on the street and say she'd seen his name in the paper. The old men playing dominoes outside the corner store would nod their approval. He had made it, but he'd never forgotten where he came from. The success felt sweeter because he had someone to share it with. Amelia had been his partner in every sense for 15 years, Or at least that's what he'd believed until 6 months ago, when the foundation of his life developed cracks he hadn't seen coming. She was the one who'd encouraged him to take the risk of starting his own firm, who'd sat up with him at their kitchen table going over loan applications and business plans, while the dawn light crept across the pages. She'd been his first call when he landed a major contract, his safe harbor when a project fell through. They'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside. The four-bedroom house in Druid Hills with the garden Amelia attended every weekend, the two cars in the driveway, the vacation photos from Mexico and Martha's Vineyard framed in their living room. They tried for children and faced the heartbreak of 3 miscarriages, each loss drawing them closer in their shared grief. Or so Marcus had thought. He'd believed their marriage was the one thing in his life he didn't have to question, the one piece of solid ground in a world that could shift without warning. But solid ground can develop sinkholes beneath the surface. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening in April, when Marcus arrived home early from a site inspection and found Amelia on the back deck, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and intimate in a way that made him pause in the doorway. She was laughing at something the person on the other end had said, her whole body language soft and open in a way it hadn't been with him in months. When she noticed him, her expression shifted so quickly it was like watching a mask drop into place. She ended the call and smiled brightly, too brightly, and told him it was just her sister. But her sister's name wasn't Vanessa, which was the name he glimpsed on the screen before it went dark. He didn't confront her that day. Maybe that was his first mistake. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the long hours at work were making him imagine problems that didn't exist. But the universe has a way of insisting on truth, even when we'd rather live in comfortable illusions. Vanessa Klein had entered their lives 8 months earlier as an interior designer, hired for a high-profile project, a boutique hotel in Midtown that Thompson Design Group was converting from an old office building. She was 34, with the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive salons and a personal trainer, her dark hair always perfectly styled, her clothes tailored to show off a figure she clearly worked hard to maintain. Marcus had thought she was talented but exhausting, the kind of person who filled every silence with chatter and treated every meeting like a performance. Amelia had met her at the project launch party, and the two women had hit it off immediately, bonding over shared tastes in art and wine and the challenges of working in male-dominated industries. Soon Vanessa was showing up at their house for weekend brunches, texting Amelia about gallery openings and yoga classes, becoming a fixture in their social circle so gradually that Marcus didn't notice when friendly acquaintance became something more intimate. The day he discovered the affair was a Saturday in late spring, the kind of morning when Atlanta's humidity hadn't yet become oppressive and the light through the trees still felt gentle. Marcus had been in his home office going through contracts when he'd reached for his phone charger and grabbed Amelia's by mistake. Her phone lit up with a text preview, and Vanessa's name appeared above words that made his stomach drop. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." His hand had gone numb. He'd stood there in the sunlight, streaming through the window, staring at those words until they blurred, his mind trying to construct an innocent explanation, even as his gut knew better. When Amelia came home from her morning run, flushed and glowing, he'd confronted her in their living room, the phone between them like evidence at a crime scene. He'd expected denial, excuses, maybe anger turned defensive. What he got instead was something worse: relief. She'd looked almost grateful to have the secret out, her shoulders dropping as if she'd been carrying a weight she was glad to set down. She admitted everything. The affair had been going on for 5 months. It had started as an emotional connection and escalated into something physical. And no, she wasn't sorry. She was in love with Vanessa. She wanted a divorce. The floor had seemed to tilt under Marcus's feet. He'd asked the obvious questions through a fog of shock. Wait, how long? What about their marriage, their vows, the life they'd built together? Amelia's answers came wrapped in a vocabulary of therapy and self-discovery. She'd been unhappy for years but hadn't known how to articulate it. She'd been suppressing her true self to fit into the life they'd created. Vanessa had helped her understand what she really wanted, who she really was. The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech. And maybe she had. Maybe while Marcus was working 70-hour weeks to build security for their future, Amelia and Vanessa had been sitting in sunlit cafes, planning his erasure from the narrative of his own life. Now here they were, 3 months later, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and industrial cleaner, the morning light making everything look too clear, too real. Amelia wanted half of everything: the house, the savings, a portion of his business. Her lawyer had filed papers that painted Marcus as a workaholic who'd neglected his wife's emotional needs, driving her into the arms of someone who actually paid attention to her. The narrative was designed to justify the betrayal, to make Marcus the villain of his own story. And Vanessa, instead of having the decency to stay in the shadows of her home wrecking, had positioned herself as Amelia's support system, her champion, sitting beside her in court like they were already the married couple, and Marcus was just an obstacle to be cleared away. Judge Harlan's voice cut through Marcus's thoughts like a blade through water. "This is an unusual situation," the judge said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp as they moved between the parties. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings, but before we proceed, I want to make sure I understand the full picture here." His gaze settled on Amelia and Vanessa, taking in the way they sat shoulder to shoulder, the body language of alliance. "Mrs. Thompson, you're seeking dissolution of marriage on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. And Ms. Klein, you're listed here as a character witness. Is that correct?" Vanessa nodded, her smile confident. The sunlight caught the pendant at her throat, a piece of jewelry Marcus recognized because he'd seen Amelia wearing it last month. The casual intimacy of that shared accessory felt like another small knife. "That's correct, Your Honor," Vanessa said, her voice smooth. "I'm here to support Amelia through this difficult transition and to provide testimony about her emotional state during the marriage." "I see," Judge Harlan said. Something in his tone suggested he saw more than Vanessa intended. He turned to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, you're representing yourself today. Is that correct?" Marcus stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. "No, Your Honor. My attorney is running late due to an emergency, but she's on her way. Her name is Simone Carter. She called the clerk about 20 minutes ago." "Very well." The judge made a note. "We'll wait another 15 minutes. In the meantime, let's address the preliminary matters." He looked down at the papers before him, the silence stretching out like the shadows on the courtroom floor. When he looked up again, there was something in his expression that Marcus couldn't quite read, but it made his pulse quicken with something that felt dangerously like hope. Outside the courtroom windows, Atlanta moved through its ordinary Friday morning, cars streaming down the streets, people hurrying to work with coffee cups and briefcases. The whole city bathed in September sunlight that promised nothing but another warm day. But inside this room, in the charged quiet before the storm, Marcus Thompson sat with his hands folded and his heart steady, waiting for the moment when truth would either save him or finish what betrayal had started. The memory arrived without warning, pulling Marcus back 16 years to a Sunday afternoon in Piedmont Park, when the world had been nothing but possibility and sunlight. He'd been 26, newly hired at Brennan and Associates, still carrying the cautious optimism of someone who'd beaten the odds, but knew how quickly fortune could turn. The park had been hosting an arts festival, the paths lined with white tents where local artists displayed paintings and pottery and jewelry that caught the light. Marcus had gone alone, taking a break from the relentless studying he'd been doing to prepare for his architectural licensing exam. He'd been standing in front of a booth selling landscape photographs when he'd heard laughter that sounded like music, bright and unguarded, and turned to see a woman in a yellow sundress examining a set of blown glass sculptures. Amelia had been 24 then, her natural hair pulled back in a puff that framed her face, her skin glowing in the dappled shade under the oak trees. She was debating between a blue glass vase and a green one, holding them up to the light and watching the way the sun transformed the colors. Marcus had found himself walking over without planning to, drawn by something he couldn't name. He'd said something about how the blue one would look better in north-facing light, while the green would catch southern exposure. A comment so dorky and specific that she'd laughed and asked if he was a photographer. When he'd explained he was an architect, her whole face had lit up with interest. She'd told him she worked in marketing for a nonprofit that built affordable housing, that she'd always been fascinated by the way spaces could shape human experience. They'd spent the next 3 hours walking through the festival, talking about everything from Le Corbusier to the gentrification reshaping Atlanta's neighborhoods, stopping for lemonade from a vendor whose cup sweated in the afternoon heat. By the time the sun started its descent toward evening, painting the park in shades of amber and rose, Marcus knew two things with absolute certainty. He was going to marry this woman, and she was going to wreck him or save him, or quite possibly both. He'd asked for her number by the glass sculpture booth where they'd met, and she'd written it on his palm with a pen from her purse, her touch sending electricity up his arm. The blue vase had still been sitting there, and on impulse he'd bought it for her, spending more than he could afford on what was essentially a gesture toward a future he hoped they'd share. She'd protested but accepted it, cradling it carefully as they walked to the parking lot. And when they'd said goodbye, she'd stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, leaving the scent of cocoa butter and possibility. That blue glass vase had sat on their kitchen windowsill for 14 years, catching the morning light the same way it had in the park that first day. It had survived 3 moves, the transition from his cramped bachelor apartment to their first shared place to the house in Druid Hills. It had been there on the counter the morning after their wedding, filled with white roses from the ceremony. It had been there the morning after the first miscarriage, empty because neither of them could bear to put flowers in it, and there the morning after the third, filled with grocery store daisies, because Amelia had said she needed to see something alive and growing. It had been a constant, a small blue reminder of the best decision Marcus had ever made. 2 weeks after he'd discovered the affair, Marcus had come home to find the vase gone. In its place sat a modern ceramic piece he didn't recognize, angular and gray and utterly without warmth. When he'd asked Amelia about it, she'd shrugged and said she'd been redecorating, that the vase was old and didn't fit the aesthetic anymore. She donated it to Goodwill. The casual cruelty of that erasure had hurt more than he wanted to admit. She hadn't just removed an object. She tried to delete the memory it held, to rewrite their history so that the beginning of their story mattered less than its ending. But Marcus still carried that day in Piedmont Park inside him, could still see the way the sunlight had turned Amelia's yellow dress almost luminous, could still feel the hope that had bloomed in his chest like something inevitable and right. The loss of the vase felt like a preview of the larger loss to come, not just of Amelia, but of the version of himself who'd believed in the permanence of love. Their courtship had been everything the romantic comedies promised and real life rarely delivered. Marcus had called her the next day, and they'd gone to dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Little 5 Points, where they ate with their hands from a shared platter and talked until the staff started stacking chairs on tables. The second date had been a tour of the Fox Theater, both of them craning their necks to admire the faux Arabian palace architecture, while a guide droned on about the building's history. The third date had been a drive out to Stone Mountain, where they'd hiked to the top in the morning cool and sat on the granite summit, watching the city spread out below them like a promise. Amelia had told him about growing up in Savannah, the youngest of 4 daughters in a family that valued education and church in equal measure. Her father was a pastor, her mother a school teacher, and she'd been raised on the understanding that respectability was armor against a world that looked for reasons to dismiss you. She'd moved to Atlanta for college and stayed for the opportunities, building a career that let her feel like she was contributing something meaningful. Marcus had told her about his mother's death 2 years earlier, how cancer had taken her quickly but not quickly enough, how he still sometimes reached for the phone to call her before remembering she was gone. He told her about his brothers, one in the military and one teaching high school in Alabama, about how they'd scattered after their mother passed like dandelion seeds on the wind. He told her about the weight of being the successful one, the pressure to justify all the sacrifices that had been made on his behalf. Amelia had listened with an attention that felt like a gift, asking questions that showed she understood the complexity of ambition tangled with survivor's guilt. She'd taken his hand on that mountaintop and said something that had stayed with him through all the years that followed. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. And for a long time, he hadn't. They'd been a team, splitting the weight of life's challenges, celebrating the victories together. They'd married at her family's church in Savannah on a June afternoon when the humidity made the air feel thick as honey and the smell of magnolias drifted through the open doors. Marcus's brothers had stood up with him, uncomfortable in their rented tuxedos, but grinning with genuine happiness. Amelia's sisters had surrounded her in matching lavender dresses, fussing with her train and veil in the small room where she'd prepared. When she'd walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Marcus had felt his throat tighten with the reality of it. This brilliant woman choosing him, trusting him with her future. The vows had been traditional, but felt radical in their sincerity, for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and health. He'd meant every word. He'd believed she did too. The early years of marriage had been marked by a determined optimism, both of them working long hours but coming home to each other with stories and frustrations and small triumphs. They'd saved aggressively to buy the house in Druid Hills, walking through the empty rooms and planning what each space would become, painting walls on weekends and refinishing the hardwood floors themselves. Amelia had wanted children immediately, her biological clock ticking louder with each birthday, and Marcus had wanted whatever would make her happy. But pregnancy proved elusive. The first miscarriage came at 10 weeks, a sudden cramping that sent them to the emergency room at 2 in the morning. The sterile lights and sympathetic nurse and the doctor's gentle explanation that these things happen. It's very common. You can try again. They'd grieve together, holding each other through the nights when Amelia would wake up crying and tried again. The second loss came at 8 weeks, the third at 12, far enough along that they'd started telling people, buying tiny clothes, imagining a future that evaporated in blood and pain. After the third miscarriage, something had shifted in Amelia. She'd thrown herself into work with a fervor that seemed less like ambition and more like escape, taking on extra projects, traveling for conferences, filling her calendar until there was no space left for stillness or grief. Marcus had tried to reach her, suggesting they see a counselor or take a vacation or just spend a weekend doing nothing but being together. But she'd retreated into a brittle cheerfulness that felt like a wall, insisting she was fine. They were fine. Everything was fine. He'd believed her because he'd needed to, because acknowledging the distance between them would have meant facing a problem he didn't know how to solve. So he'd focused on his work, on building the firm into something stable and successful, telling himself that providing financial security was its own form of love. He hadn't noticed when Amelia started spending more time with Vanessa, or rather, he'd noticed but hadn't understood the significance. Girls' nights and weekend yoga classes and shopping trips had seemed healthy, a sign that Amelia was rebuilding her social life after the isolation that grief had imposed. When Vanessa started appearing at their dinner parties and holiday gatherings, Marcus had been pleased that Amelia had found such a close friend. He'd been oblivious to the way their conversations would go quiet when he entered a room, the inside jokes that excluded him, the growing intimacy that was hiding in plain sight. He'd been so focused on the blueprint of their life that he'd missed the foundation crumbling beneath his feet. The worst part, the part that kept him awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, was that he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when Amelia had stopped loving him. Had it been gradual, an erosion so slow he'd missed the warning signs? Or had there been a specific day, a specific conversation or silence, or disappointment that had severed something essential? He replayed their history like a film he could pause and rewind, looking for the frame where everything changed. Was it after the third miscarriage when he'd said something clumsy about adoption and she'd looked at him like he was a stranger? Was it the night he'd missed their anniversary dinner because a client emergency kept him at the office until midnight? Was it some smaller moment he'd forgotten entirely? A careless word or neglected gesture that had accumulated into resentment? But sitting in the courtroom now, watching Amelia and Vanessa whisper to each other with the ease of established lovers, Marcus was beginning to suspect that the question of when was less important than the question of whether. Whether he'd ever really known the woman he married, or whether he'd loved a version of her he'd constructed from hope and need. Whether their marriage had been as solid as he'd believed, or whether he'd been living in a story she'd already abandoned. The uncertainty was almost worse than the betrayal. It made him doubt his own memory, his own judgment, his ability to see what was real. Judge Harlan's voice pulled him back to the present. "Mr. Thompson, your attorney has arrived." Marcus turned to see Simone Carter hurrying through the courtroom doors, her briefcase swinging, her expression apologetic. Simone was 52, a bulldog of a lawyer who'd built her reputation defending men in contentious divorces, and Marcus had hired her on the recommendation of a colleague who'd gone through his own marital battlefield. She slid into the seat beside him, slightly out of breath, and leaned in to whisper, "Sorry. Multi-car accident on the connector. Are we on the record yet?" "Just preliminaries," Marcus whispered back. "They haven't started testimony." Simone's eyes tracked across the aisle to where Amelia and Vanessa sat, and something hardened in her expression. "So she actually brought her," Simone murmured. "Bold move, stupid but bold." She pulled out a file folder, flipped it open, and scanned her notes with the speed of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Then she looked up at the judge and said clearly, "Your Honor, Simone Carter for the respondent. I apologize for my tardiness. I'm ready to proceed." Judge Harlan nodded. "Very well. Let's begin with opening statements. Mrs. Thompson's counsel, you may proceed." Amelia's lawyer stood, a young woman named Jennifer Park, who had the sleek efficiency of someone who'd graduated top of her class and never let anyone forget it. She approached the bench with a tablet in her hand, the modern lawyer's Bible, and launched into an opening statement that painted Amelia as a victim of emotional neglect. According to Jennifer's narrative, Marcus had prioritized his career over his marriage, leaving Amelia isolated and lonely, working such long hours that they barely saw each other, dismissing her emotional needs as secondary to his professional ambitions. The miscarriages had been a turning point, Jennifer argued, a series of traumas that Marcus hadn't properly supported her through, leaving her to grieve alone while he buried himself in blueprints and construction schedules. Vanessa had entered Amelia's life at a vulnerable moment and provided the emotional support and understanding that had been missing from her marriage. The affair was regrettable, Jennifer acknowledged with just the right note of sympathy, but it was a symptom rather than a cause of the marriage's failure. Amelia deserved a fair division of assets that recognized her contributions to Marcus's success, the emotional labor she'd performed for 15 years, and the new life she was bravely trying to build. It was a compelling story, Marcus had to admit. It had the virtue of being partially true, which made it more dangerous than an outright lie. He had worked long hours. He had struggled to know how to comfort Amelia through the miscarriages, his own grief tangled with a masculine helplessness that made him want to fix the problem when the problem was unfixable. He had failed her in ways both large and small. But the story Jennifer was telling erased Amelia's agency, turned her into a passive victim of circumstance rather than a woman who'd made active choices. It erased the conversations where Marcus had suggested counseling and Amelia had refused. It erased the weekend trips he'd planned that she'd canceled. It erased the thousands of small ways he'd tried to bridge the distance between them while she'd been building a secret life with someone else. When Jennifer sat down, looking satisfied with her performance, Simone stood and approached the bench with a different energy entirely. She didn't have a tablet. She had a yellow legal pad with handwritten notes, and she had the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing the facts were on her side. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "my client is here today because his wife decided to end their marriage. Not through honest conversation, but through betrayal. She's asking this court to reward that betrayal with half of everything Mr. Thompson built through his own hard work, his own sacrifice, his own integrity. But before we divide assets, we need to examine exactly what we're dividing and how we got here." She paused, letting the words settle. "Because the story Miss Park just told you is a fairy tale, and I'm going to show you the receipts." The phrase landed with a ripple of interest through the courtroom. Even Judge Harlan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, the first full breath he'd taken since entering the building. Simone walked back to the defense table and pulled out her own folder, thick with documents. "We'll be presenting evidence that shows Mrs. Thompson's affair began not at a vulnerable moment, but at a calculated one. We'll show financial records proving she and Ms. Klein have been planning this divorce for months, funneling money into separate accounts, undervaluing shared assets. We'll demonstrate that Mr. Thompson made repeated attempts to save this marriage while Mrs. Thompson was actively sabotaging it. And most importantly, Your Honor, we're going to ask this court to consider whether someone who enters a divorce proceeding with unclean hands deserves the equitable distribution she's requesting. Amelia's expression had shifted from confident to wary. Vanessa leaned in to whisper something, but Amelia shook her head slightly, her jaw tight. Jennifer was already on her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory accusations without. This is opening statement, Miss Park, Judge Harlan said mildly. You'll have your chance to respond. Continue, Ms. Carter. Industry contacts, or through Mrs. Thompson, who had access to her husband's confidential business information. Simone didn't wait for an answer. Let me ask you this. Did you use your position on that project to gain information about Mr. Thompson's business practices, client relationships, and financial situation? I did my job professionally. Your job or your espionage? Simone's voice was sharp now. Because I have testimony from 3 employees of Thompson Design Group who witnessed you going through Mr. Thompson's office when he wasn't there, photographing documents, asking questions about company finances that had nothing to do with interior design. That's not professionalism, Ms. Klein. That's corporate spying in service of a divorce strategy. The murmurs in the courtroom were louder now, a susurrus of shock and judgment. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place, the scope of the betrayal expanding beyond a simple affair into something more calculated and cruel. Vanessa hadn't just been Amelia's lover. She'd been her accomplice in dismantling everything Marcus had built. Simone pressed on. You and Mrs. Thompson have signed a lease together, correct? Yes. Using Mr. Thompson's money? Amelia has a right to access their joint accounts, to prepare for a future that includes you. Simone let that hang. Mrs. Klein, I want to be very clear about what we're looking at here. You entered into an affair with a married woman. You helped her plan a divorce strategy designed to maximize her financial gain. You used your professional access to gather intelligence about her husband's business. And now you're sitting in this courtroom as a character witness, asking a judge to validate a divorce that you orchestrated. Do you have any shame at all? Objection! Jennifer was standing. This is harassment. Withdrawn, Simone said, turning away from Vanessa with a gesture of dismissal. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor. I think we've established what kind of character she has. Judge Harlan's expression was granite. Mrs. Klein, you may step down. As Vanessa fled back to her seat, the judge looked at both attorneys. I'm going to call a 15-minute recess. When we return, I'll hear closing arguments, and then I'll render my decision. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down hard, and the room slowly exhaled. Marcus sat motionless as people around him stood and stretched and whispered. Simone touched his arm gently. That went well, she said quietly. Better than well. The judge is pissed. What happens now? Marcus asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Now, Simone gathered her files, now we find out if justice and the law are still on speaking terms. Through the tall windows, the Atlanta sun climbed toward noon, indifferent and bright, illuminating the courthouse steps where people smoked cigarettes and checked their phones, carrying on with ordinary lives while Marcus's hung in the balance. He closed his eyes and thought of the blue glass vase, catching light in a park 16 years ago, when the future had seemed like something you could hold in your hands without breaking. The 15-minute recess stretched like taffy, seconds becoming elastic as Marcus stood in the courthouse hallway, where afternoon light slanted through windows that overlooked the Atlanta streets below. He watched traffic move in predictable patterns, delivery trucks and sedans, and cyclists navigating the grid, everyone going somewhere with purpose, while he existed in this suspended state between married and not, whole and divided. Simone had stepped away to make phone calls, her voice a low murmur near the stairwell, and Marcus was alone with his thoughts and the occasional courthouse regular who shuffled past with the resigned expression of someone for whom legal proceedings were routine. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos he probably shouldn't look at, but couldn't help revisiting. Amelia laughing at their wedding reception, her head thrown back in unguarded joy. The two of them on Stone Mountain, squinting against the sun, a selfie from their 10th anniversary dinner, where they'd both looked happy and convinced of their permanence. The images felt like artifacts from an archaeological dig, evidence of a civilization that no longer existed. He wondered what Amelia saw when she looked at these same photos, whether she felt the weight of what had been lost or just the relief of escape. A hand touched his elbow, and Marcus turned to find an older black man in a maintenance uniform, his face lined with the kind of wisdom that came from seeing everything twice. "You look like you're carrying the world, son," the man said, his voice gentle. "Whatever's happening in there, remember it's just one day. Tomorrow comes whether we're ready or not." The unexpected kindness cracked something in Marcus's chest. "Thank you," he managed, his throat tight. "I needed to hear that." The man nodded. "My wife and I just celebrated 43 years. Some of them were harder than others, but we decided early on that we were on the same team, even when we wanted to kill each other." He smiled sadly. "Not everyone makes that choice. Not everyone can. But you're going to be all right, whatever happens in that room. You've got the look of a man who knows how to rebuild." Before Marcus could respond, Simone was beside him, tucking her phone away. "We're being called back in. You ready?" Marcus looked at the maintenance worker, who gave him an encouraging nod, then back at his attorney. "As ready as I'll ever be." The courtroom had refilled during the recess, the gallery more crowded now with afternoon spectators who'd heard about the dramatic testimony and wanted to see how it resolved. Marcus slid back into his seat, feeling the weight of eyes on his back, the collective curiosity about the man whose wife had brought her mistress to divorce court. Across the aisle, Amelia sat rigid and pale, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like dread. Vanessa was beside her still, but the physical distance between them had grown by inches, some invisible boundary reasserting itself under the pressure of exposure. Judge Harlan entered, and the room rose in automatic respect before settling again. The judge arranged his papers with deliberate care, then looked up at the assembled parties with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read, but that sent a flutter of hope through his chest. "Before we proceed to closing arguments," the judge began, "I want to address something directly. This court has a long tradition of trying to treat divorcing parties with dignity and fairness, recognizing that the end of a marriage is painful enough without legal proceedings adding unnecessary cruelty. But this court also has an obligation to the truth and to equitable justice under the law." He paused, his gaze moving to Amelia and Vanessa. "What I've witnessed this morning troubles me deeply. I've seen evidence of deception, financial manipulation, and a coordinated effort to defraud Mr. Thompson of assets he earned through his own labor. I've seen a romance conducted in the shadows, while one party continued to benefit from a marriage she was actively undermining. And I've seen an astonishing lack of accountability from both Mrs. Thompson and Ms. Klein, who seem to believe that love justifies dishonesty and that wanting a new life excuses burning down the old, one without regard for who gets hurt." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused its hum. Judge Harlan continued, "Ms. Park, I'll hear your closing argument, but I'll warn you now that I've already formed some strong opinions about the credibility of your client's testimony." "Proceed." Jennifer stood, her earlier confidence visibly shaken, and delivered a closing argument that felt perfunctory and defensive. She emphasized the no-fault nature of Georgia divorce law, argued that whatever Amelia's mistakes in conducting the affair, she was still entitled to equitable distribution of marital assets, and pleaded for the court to recognize the emotional abuse of neglect, even if it wasn't documented in bank statements. It was a competent argument, but it landed flat in the atmosphere Simone had created, like trying to defend a sandcastle against an incoming tide. When Jennifer sat down, Simone rose with the controlled energy of a runner approaching the finish line. "Your Honor, this case is not complicated. Mr. Thompson entered into marriage in good faith. He worked tirelessly to provide a comfortable life for himself and his wife. He weathered the trauma of multiple miscarriages while trying to support a spouse who was retreating from him. He suggested counseling and was refused. He planned romantic gestures that were rejected or sabotaged. And when he finally discovered